Minnesota Housing welcomes you to today's information session on the process of how to receive a 4% only housing tax credit allocation for bonds issued pursuant to an allocation of state volume cap by MMB. I'm Devin Pullman, a middle manager working with federal programs, including the tax credit program in the multifamily division. I'll be moderating today's session, including providing an orientation to the material staff have prepared to present today. While Minnesota Housing also offers tax credits competitively through the annual consolidated RFP process, today's focus is on securing 4% tax credits for bonds issued pursuant to an allocation of state volume cap by MMB. Shorthand, we call this 4% only. Section 42 of the Internal Revenue Code establishes a separate set of procedures to obtain housing tax credits through the issuance of tax-exempt bonds. Developers need to be aware of Minnesota Housing's tax credit qualified allocation plan, as Section 42M provides that in order for a project to receive an allocation of tax credits through the issuance of tax-exempt bonds, the project must satisfy the requirements of the QAP, Qualified Allocation Plan. Developers should also be aware of tax credit sub-allocators and their respective QAPs, if the project is in a sub-allocator jurisdiction. We will cover this topic and sub-allocator locations in today's presentation. There are four main topics that staff have prepared materials to cover and present to you today. First, we've implemented new processes for developers to work more closely with us through an optional pre-application phase and after bond issuance, which we'll cover today. Second, we're developing new resources to better illustrate the timeline and process to receive a 4% only housing tax credit allocation, including new resources on our scoring process and roadmaps that depict how projects in various locations serving both preservation and workforce housing and senior housing needs can be successful. Third, we'll highlight the 42M submission requirements, including how to submit materials through our new online customer portal, including providing a live demo. Fourth, we'll provide some compliance-specific information on preservation projects. I want to also highlight that today's presentation really focuses on the 4% only tax credit process. However, the Qualified Allocation Plan is reviewed annually, and the annual review incorporates several opportunities for public comment. I encourage you to reach out to the tax credit team if you have any questions and visit our tax credit webpage on Minnesota Housing's website for more information about this annual process, including our annual public comment period. We do encourage participation and review of our qualified allocation plan when it goes out for public comment. Let me take a few minutes to introduce and thank today's presenters, who include Summer Jefferson. Summer is our tax credit program manager. She is our day-to-day point person for the tax credit program. She will cover the timeline for working with Minnesota Housing on an allocation of tax credits, including covering details of our newly launched pre-application process, requirements for the 42M submission, and she'll facilitate details on how to submit materials to Minnesota Housing via our online portal application, which Karen Wilbright will demonstrate. Karen Wilbright is our portal business lead. She helps to ensure that all of the documents required for our submission can be readily and easily made transferable to us via the online portal. Our third presenter today is Ann Heitlinger. She's our preservation middle manager in the division. Ann will provide scoring information on new tools we've developed that we've coined our Roadmap to 40. We do require that these projects meet a minimum of 40 points to meet our threshold requirements. Our scoring framework provides a number of different paths for projects of different types, serving different Minnesota populations with affordable housing in different Minnesota locations to achieve the 40-point minimum threshold as required under our QAP. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Summer Jefferson.
Thank you, Devin. In this section, I'd like to provide some background on 4% housing tax credits in the Qualified Allocation Plan. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program is a federal resource governed by IRS law. The program provides tax credits to companies that invest in affordable rental housing, reducing their federal tax liability by the amount of the tax credits for 10 years. In exchange for this reduction, investors purchase the tax credits and agree to keep units affordable to households earning 60% of area median income or less. The sales proceeds are then invested in new construction or acquisition rehab of rental housing. There are two types of tax credits referred to as the 9% and 4% credit. 9% credits are a limited resource, and each state has an annual volume cap. 4% credits are not limited, do not count against the state's volume cap, and are only available to a project when private activity tax-exempt bond financing is used. Section 42 establishes a separate set of procedures to obtain tax credits through the issuance of tax-exempt bonds. Minnesota Housing allocates credits in two different ways: through our competitive process in conjunction with the Consolidated RFP and Round 2, and via our 4% only process on a pipeline basis. As Devin mentioned, Section 42 requires each state or allocator to create an annual qualified allocation plan. The allocation plans consist of three core documents: the QAP, the HTC Program Procedural Manual, and the Self-Scoring Worksheet. These documents and other application information can be found on Minnesota Housing's tax credit webpage. So Minnesota Housing is different than other states. Minnesota Housing is the primary allocating agency for tax credits, but we are not the only tax credit allocator. State statute creates local suballocators. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Washington County, and Dakota counties are suballocators that issue credits in addition to the state in Minnesota. For 4% only developments, Minnesota Housing's QAP applies to the whole state, except for these jurisdictions. Each of these suballocators publish their own annual QAP and determine how their credits will be allocated on a competitive and on a 4% basis. So what year QAP should you use? You should use the QAP in which the year in which the tax-exempt bonds were first issued for the project. That determines which QAP applies and the credits that will be allocated. The amount of the bond should be an amount sufficient to meet the 50% test. So for example, if you receive a partial allocation from MMB and the amount is not enough for you to meet the 50% test and be eligible for the credits, the second allocation and then the subsequent issuance will determine the QAP date. So what is the actual 50% test? This is an eligibility test required by Section 42. In order to be eligible for 4% tax credits, at least 50% of the aggregate basis of the building plus land must be financed by bonds subject to the private activity bond volume cap limits. A complete application must be submitted to Minnesota Housing prior to bond issuance. If you're closing on the real estate, the application must be submitted at least 6 weeks prior to the closing. This will allow time for analysis and processing. And if you are parking your bond, you just need to submit your application prior to that issuance. If you are not closing on your real estate, Minnesota will only do a preliminary review for completion. Once the development is closer to closing, the owner will submit additional updated documentation 6 weeks prior to closing. And that is when we'll do our thorough analysis and issue the preliminary determination letter. So one of the resources that was mentioned, that Devin mentioned, that we have created is an annual timeline for 4% only tax credit deals. This will be available on our website as well. The timeline is meant to be illustrated of the fact that Minnesota Housing is always open for business and gives you an idea of when you can submit pre-applications and 42M applications. So beginning in November, the developer can initiate an optional pre-application process that is available with the agency. With this, you can get a determination for initial scoring and the preliminary predictive model determination to ensure cost reasonableness. In January, the developer applies for bond allocation from MMB. And then once that allocation is received, the 120-day clock starts. Within the next few weeks, around the end of January, beginning of February, the agency will send out communication providing information on our 4% tax credit process. And within 6 weeks, around February or March, the agency will send out correspondence to schedule a light launch meeting. So this is a meeting that will be scheduled with an underwriter, our architectural staff from Minnesota Housing, and the owner. And it's a new process that we've created to review 4% only tax credit requirements, walk through some of the process, the timeline, including design standards. It's an opportunity for you to be able to meet and discuss any issues or concerns with underwriting and our architectural staff. Step 6 is the submission of the application to Minnesota Housing. This includes the preliminary determination letter from the bond issuer, a 50% test verification letter from a CPA, the preliminary predictive cost model or scoring determination letter, if applicable, application fees and preliminary determination fees, and the multifamily workbook. Starting this year, all 4% applications will be submitted via our new multifamily customer portal. The portal will have a detailed checklist of all the items that need to be submitted for your 42M application. Step 7, the bonds are issued or the real estate closing occurs. And then in step 8, is a 42M resubmittal for developments that have parked their bonds, and we'll talk more about this later on in the presentation. Devin stated earlier, we are in the process of creating new resources to post our website, so including a handout version of this timeline and then scoring resources such as the roadmap to 40. So look for these materials to be available sometime in February, and be sure to sign up for our e-news to receive ongoing communication about tax credits. So in the next few slides, I want to give you more information about the pre-application process and the different types of requests. There are a few changes in the amended 2018 QAP that have an impact on the 4% allocation requirements. So in order for a project to receive credits, it must meet one of our strategic priority policy thresholds. It must meet the 40-point minimum score requirement, and it must not exceed the agency's predictive cost model by more than 25%. Any project that exceeds the model must request a waiver from our board of directors. This year, Minnesota Housing has implemented a new optional pre-application process for developers to receive a predictive cost model and scoring determination prior to applying to M&B for an allocation of tax-exempt bonds, or to Minnesota Housing for an allocation of credits. While this process is optional, we do strongly encourage developers to take advantage of this option to help mitigate some of the risks associated with the changes in requirements. As I said, this process will be open annually, starting in November for submission to M&B in the following year. If you are pursuing the pre-application process, you will need to provide information at least 30 days prior to your submission of your full 42M application. This is designed to be an iterative process, so it's not a black box like our competitive funding rounds. If there are any issues, Minnesota Housing will be in touch and contact you. If there are scoring discrepancies, we will definitely discuss any issues, ask for any additional documentation we may need, and work with you to kind of identify ways to improve your scoring. If the project meets the requirements, we will issue a preliminary predictive model or scoring determination letter. You should submit this with your full 42M application, and this gives you assurances that your project currently meets the requirements and should not have any issues as long as your project does not substantially change. The pre-application submittals are the predictive model request form, the workbook, self-scoring worksheet, and then any scoring backup and documentation. All of these documents can be found in the portal along with the external help text to help you complete the document. We understand that scoring may be an area that some people may be concerned with. So in addition to the pre-application process and technical assistance, the agency has created a resource called the Roadmap to 40 Points. It depicts how different projects or different project types in various locations can be successful in the 2018 and the 2019 QAP. Anne is going to cover some of this information and give some background of the analysis that we conducted to get to this, to create these documents, and then talk through about some of the additional preservation considerations.
We have created 3 examples of how projects can get to 40 points. We mapped out these 3 examples for both the 2018 and 2019 QAPs. For 2018, I'm going to discuss both a metro preservation project and a new construction project in Greater Minnesota. And for 2019, I'm going to walk through a senior suburban project. In the preservation example, the project is located in Brooklyn Center, within a half mile of an express bus stop or park and ride. It meets one of the 3 preservation risks of loss. We assume the project will not exercise the qualified contract during the term of the LURA, and that the owner will want to retain the HAP contract. For readiness, we assume that the project has some existing debt that a public lender has approved can be assumed by the new owner, or that there is new local financing in the project. The project will be smoke-free and have high-speed internet. By meeting these categories, the project would receive 53 points and meet the preservation strategic priority. Other options for getting to 40 points for a project such as this would include cost containment for 6 points, additional local contributions, which could add up to 10 points, or minority business enterprise or women business enterprise as, say, an architect or local contractor. Household targeting could also be an option if at least 75% of the units were 2 bedrooms, and that is worth 10 points. Now we move to our new construction workforce housing example in Greater Minnesota. And here we have a 60-unit building in Mankato. It is designed for families, so it meets the household targeting requirement because it has 2 and 3 bedroom units. We have assumed a waiver of the qualified contract for an additional 5 years to 25 years. The rents are at 60% of AMI. We assume that the project is relatively near a bus stop, so it does get 4 points for location efficiency. Its location in Mankato makes it eligible for the rural and tribal points. We assumed a local source of funds for financial readiness, such as TIF, and that the project would meet the cost containment thresholds. As a reminder, cost containment thresholds that will apply to bond projects in 2018 have already been published, so the owner is not making a blind choice in taking the cost containment points. The project would be smoke-free and have high-speed internet. This provides a total of 48 points. The project meets the workforce housing strategic priority because local employers are supportive of the development as their workers need more housing in the Mankato area. Other options to 40 points would include additional local contributions, which could also increase the score under readiness, a minority business enterprise or women business enterprise for an additional 3 points, and we do have some women-owned contractors out in Greater Minnesota, or waiving the qualified contract for up to 30 years for an additional 4 points. Now we'll move on to 2019, and the project we're going to highlight here is a new construction suburban senior project. You could also think of this as a project for general occupancy, but with smaller unit types. So this is an economic integration example, new construction senior project in Woodbury. We have assumed that will be a small number of project-based vouchers at the property, and the rents are at 60% of AMI. The location is in an economic integration census tract. It is within half a mile of a park and ride or express bus stop. The project would have TIF and a deferred developer fee, which would allow it to maximize the readiness points. We have assumed that cost containment points could be taken. Given that the building will serve seniors or smaller households, we included universal design points and smoke-free. This combination yields 47 points. The project meets the strategic priority of economic integration due to its location. Other options for getting to 40 points could be minority or women-owned enterprises for 3 points, waiver of exercising the qualified contract, or lower intermediary costs, which would add 1 or 2 points.
So I briefly want to just discuss the light launch meeting. We did discuss this briefly before. The launch light meeting will be scheduled after the development has received an allocation of bonds from MMB. During the meeting, staff will review design requirements and other 42M application requirements. This is just, again, designed to be a touch point early on in the process to kind of prevent some of any issues, and so that everyone's on the same page as far as requirements go from a tax credit perspective. The 42M application submission is required for an allocation of 4% credits and an issuance of the tax credit preliminary determination letter, or what we call the 42M1. These are some of the required items that I covered earlier during the review of the timeline. These would be submitted with your application. Again, the portal has a detailed checklist of all the required items to submit with your application. So in addition to the preliminary determination letter from your bond issuer and a 50% tax verification letter from CPA, there's an application fee of $800 and a preliminary determination fee of 3.5% of the tax credit allocation. You also would need to provide evidence that you've received an allocation from MMB, along with the entire application checklist. I also want to note again that developments that are parking their bonds will have to submit an updated checklist via the 42M resubmittal phase. All of these submission requirements and items will be submitted via the newly created multifamily customer portal. The portal allows customers to log in and allows the customer to build an application checklist based upon the type of proposal that is being submitted. And the portal eliminates the need for hard copies and allows you to submit documents and collaborate with agency staff from pre-application all the way to 8609. And with that, I'll turn it over to Karen, who will lead us through a brief demonstration.
Hi, my name is Karen Wilbright, and as Devin mentioned, I am the portal business lead here at Minnesota Housing. Minnesota Housing launched our customer portal back in April of 2017. So those of you that completed the consolidated request for proposals will be familiar with it. But for those of you that are new today, I wanted to point out first a few resources on our website in order to help you navigate to the customer portal, as well as show you a brief demo of how to submit both your pre-app, intent to apply, and application materials for your 42M submission. So I'm going to start on our website at mnhousing.gov, and you're going to want to click on the multifamily rental partners. Then over in Quick Links on the left-hand column, click on Multifamily Customer Portal Resources. On this new page, you'll find links to our user guide, a link to the actual portal itself, as well as a number of training tutorials for you to review on various topics, including who needs a portal account, how to set up your account, and even how to get started within the system. For those of you that do not yet have a user account and login information, scroll down to the bottom of the page to the Apply for Funding section and click on the link that says Complete one request per organization through our online form. This form is a web form that will allow you to enter basic information about your organization and any users within your organization that will need access to the portal. Again, be sure to refer to this page whenever you have questions about how to complete some basic information in this portal. I'm now going to move over to actually show you a brief demonstration on how to start a project and then begin applying. After you've received all of your login information, you'll log into the portal at mnhousing.force.com/multifamilyportal. And you'll land on this funding rounds tab. In order to apply for the 2018 HTC 4% only round, you're going to click on the funding round name. And on this new page, it will show you some brief information about funding that's available, as well as some phases about the funding round. To actually start a project, I'm going to hit Apply for Funding. On this new screen, you'll be required to complete some basic information about your development, including the name, address, and if you've received funding before for this same property. You'll also be asked for information about the developer contact, project owner, project sponsor, and processing agent if applicable. After you've completed the form, hit Save. For today's demonstration, I'm now going to click over to a project that I've already created in the portal. On this new screen, you'll see some basic information about your project at the top, as well as the project phases with the checklist associated with them that you'll be required to complete. So as Summer mentioned, there is an optional pre-application available in our portal for you to complete. So in order to do that, you're going to click View Pre-Application Checklist. And in this case, I've already spun up a checklist. But if you were coming in for the first time, you would go to the Build Checklist tab. You'd select the characteristic. In this case, there's only one characteristic to choose from, and then hit Create. Once you complete that, it will spin up a checklist that shows the items that are required. In the case of the pre-application, there's only 4 application submittals. In order to actually submit a document, you'd click on the name of the checklist item, and then you'd scroll down to the File section, Upload a File. You'd navigate to your computer and locate the file you'd like to upload, and then click Open. Once done, you will hit Close, and you'll notice that the upload status for this particular item has switched to uploaded. A couple other things to note on this page. For every checklist item, there's a little communication feed. Here at this stage, you will likely not use this, and so you can hide the feed. We also include links, if available, to any particular required forms, as well as help text that is available for you in order to assist you in completing your application. So now I'm going to return to my checklist. And you'll notice in the top that there is a brief counter that shows you how many additional checklist items that need some sort of documentation added to them. Once this item becomes 0, the button that currently displays as Show Items Not Uploaded will change to a Submit button. Be sure to hit Submit in order for Minnesota Housing to receive your pre-application. Now I'm going to go back to the project and I'll walk you through the application checklist. So I'm going to click on View Application Checklist in this case. And again, I have already built the checklist for this particular project, but I want to show you how you'd go about building your checklist, or if you would like to make changes after it's built, how you can do that. So you're going to click on the Build Checklist tab, and you're going to select the characteristics of your development. So in this case, common application forms and all the tax credit scoring items, as well as the housing tax credits, are automatically selected. But I got to choose whether or not it was construction or rehab, if it included a first mortgage in the financial structure, or if it included permanent supportive housing units or people with disabilities units. So in this case, I am going to go ahead and decide to add some people with disabilities units to my project. So I'm going to select that characteristic and hit Create Checklist. Because I've already built my checklist for the first time, it will prompt me asking whether or not I want to modify, and I'm going to hit Continue because I do want to modify my checklist. Note that any files that you have are previously uploaded will stay even if you modify your checklist after the fact. So, like I mentioned in our pre-application checklist, you're going to click into the name of the item that you wish to upload a file to. You'll again see that help text, any links to documents, and will be able to easily upload your file all in one space. So now I'm going to return to checklist. So again, once I've uploaded all of my items, this countdown will go to 0 and I'll be able to submit my application to Minnesota Housing. One other thing to note, I'm going to hit clear all and then I'm going to filter using the filters on the left-hand side to filter just for the self-scoring worksheet supporting documents. You will see all of the scoring categories that require backup documentation listed in this list. If any of them do not apply, what you'll want to do is click into the item, and you'll notice that this is an optional item. So in this example, I'm going to say that eventual tenant ownership I'm not claiming points for. So I'm going to go ahead and opt out of this whole category and hit save. And now I'm going to return to my checklist. And you'll notice that the number of items required to submit has decreased. So please remember to opt out of any scoring categories that do not apply for your particular deal, and that will allow you to still submit your application. So that concludes my presentation for today. Again, I wanted to point out the fact that we have additional resources available at mnhousing.gov if you need additional assistance in completing your application.
Even though this presentation is about processes related to 4% tax credits, we also wanted to highlight a requirement for preservation projects in Minnesota. In this case, preservation means project-based rental assistance, and this is compliance with 474A.047, which stipulates 3 conditions for using bond projects for any project of this type in Minnesota, regardless of either the bond issuer or the bond allocator. And it is the issuer's responsibility to ensure these requirements are met. Number 1, the owner must extend the contract or agreement for the maximum term possible. We've seen this accomplished in 2 different ways, either through the extension of a new 20-year Section 8 contract or through signing agreements or restrictions that require the contracts to be renewed for at least 20 years. Second, the amount of reserves to be maintained at the property. There's a calculation that looks at the outstanding mortgage balance, $5,000 per unit, or the amount of reserves that exist at the time of bond issuance. In this case, we are looking at reserves that can be used just for capital repairs, so if there are debt service reserves at the property that could not be used for capital, they would be excluded from this calculation. We most often see projects meeting this requirement through the existing reserve number being applied. The key to this requirement is that the amount of, let's say, reserves must be maintained at the time of bond issuance. So reserves coming in during a third equity pay-in would not count towards this requirement. There are a variety of ways to meet this requirement. For example, for projects with HUD MAP loans, we could count the working capital reserve, which is funded at closing, and then confirm that there are sufficient funds coming in from future equity payments to meet the requirement once the working capital reserve is released. Third, we confirm that funds must be available to complete immediate repairs, which we view as critical items and those that must be completed in year 1. The process for demonstrating compliance with 474A.047 is to submit to Minnesota Housing the following documentation. An owner compliance statement. I can send you an example, and in the future this will be available on the agency website. The owner will provide documentation on the extension of the HAP contract, components of the reserve requirement, including evidence that this will be maintained at closing, such as a limited partnership agreement, information on the project's physical condition, scope of work, and the construction budget. I also request a recent project workbook. The compliance statement works best if you submit an initial draft, which later can be executed and put on letterhead once agency review is completed. We do see that this process tends to be iterative and more than one compliance statement is submitted. Once the compliance statement and documentation are approved, I will then send to the owner a draft agreement on the extension of the rental assistance and a draft agency certification on compliance with 474A.047 for review. Once they are finalized, Both the owner and the agency execute the agreement, and the agency will execute the certification. These documents are then provided by the owner to the bond issuer. I ask that you submit these materials at least 3 weeks in advance of any closing. If you are issuing bonds and parking, this process must be completed prior to bond issuance. If you have any questions, my contact information is on the slide. This concludes our presentation on 4% credits with bond allocations. We appreciate your time and attention and look forward to working with you in the future on your projects. Thank you.